This week, it's an Israel-heavy episode with news of Israel's fourth election in 2 years, the passage of an Israeli-Palestinian peace fund by Congress, and, on a local note, the short saga of the state of Minnesota leaving out the Holocaust and other genocides when revising social studies guidelines. Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. First, a hearty thanks to our corporate sponsor, Darla Kashian with RBC Wealth Management, for supporting this podcast. So I can't believe I even have to say this after 3 elections in under 2 years, after which I'm sure many of the Jews in Israel and outside of it were hoping that the Israeli government would finally start to get along, but Israel is heading to new elections on March 23rd, 2021. It's fourth in 2 years. And I'm just going to say it. Israel may be a democracy, but this is just overdoing it. This is like the drunk friend who is told, hey, maybe you've had enough for the night, and the friend takes that as a personal challenge to drink even more. It's okay to, not. Anyway, here's the situation. As a brief background, Israel, with a parliamentary-style government, has a main legislative body called the Knesset with 120 seats. In the elections, people vote not for prime minister, but for political parties, and based on the percentage of the vote, parties are assigned a number of seats in the Knesset. And then, those parties need to build coalitions to try and get a total of 61 seats or more to form a government and select a prime minister. And since 2009, the party able to successfully form government coalitions has been, without a fail, the Likud, the party of current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The problem that has continually struck Israel over the past few years is these governing coalitions either not being able to be formed because political parties really don't get along, leading to more elections, or a governing coalition falling apart, which is what happened here. On Tuesday night, there was a deadline for passing the 2020 budget that automatically triggered new elections because no budget was agreed to by the governing coalition. And yes, you heard that right. We're in the last weeks of 2020, and Israel still hasn't passed a 2020 budget, let alone a budget for 2021. So, what's the big takeaway from this other than Israel being totally politically dysfunctional? Well, 2 main things. Number 1, the nail in the coffin of the Israeli political left and center, and number 2, the ever-increasing challenges to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The main friction that led to the coalition falling apart, and in fact, the main friction that's led to 4 elections in 2 years, is between Netanyahu and his former chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, now turned politician, Benny Gantz. Gantz was head of a conglomerate of parties joined into one called Blue and White that ran as a centrist party willing to talk to and work with the political left and right. Their main argument was that Netanyahu has been around for too long, he is also on trial right now for corruption charges, and that Israel needs to move on to new leaders. And that argument did pretty well enough to make Blue and White very competitive with Likud in several elections, to the point that there wouldn't be a governing coalition, so no government formed unless the 2 parties got along. Which, for a long time, was not going to happen, because the whole point of Blue and White was saying, we're not going to negotiate with or agree to a prime minister on trial for corruption. That was the line, but then Benny Gantz crossed it. After the March 2020 elections and as COVID-19 hit Israel for the first time, Gantz caved, broke up the Blue and White conglomerate, but kept the name for his own party and joined Netanyahu. The governing coalition agreement was centered around a particular point, that Netanyahu and Gantz would both serve as prime minister in a rotation. So first, Netanyahu would occupy the position, and then Gantz would take over, and then 4 years would have passed and elections would happen normally. But the unspoken truth was always that there was no way Netanyahu would give up his position when the time came. Netanyahu is a brilliant politician who does not play nice at all and definitely wants to stay prime minister. And hey, Gantz knows this. We're talking about a guy who used to work with Netanyahu and has seen his political moves over the past decade. But he still agreed to the coalition, and the internal conflict overwhelmed him and his party. And now there's a real question of if Gantz's party will even be in the next Knesset, and the damage that's done here by Gantz crossing the one big red line blue and white stood for. The reason so many Israelis across the left, center, and right voted for blue and white. The damage done can't be overstated. Everyone knew Netanyahu would play him, and that's exactly what happened to Gantz. So, where are you going to see much hope or belief in a real Israeli political center now? Which all the more guarantees future right-wing Israeli governments for a long time. But those right-wing governments may soon be kicking Netanyahu to the curb. A defining feature of Netanyahu is that he has driven away his own party members, protégés, and close associates to become his competition. That's already true of at least 3 parties, and now there's another new one. Gidon Sa'ar, a longtime member of Likud, is breaking away to form his own party called New Hope. So, cue all of the Star Wars jokes. Sa'ar is solidly right-wing, depending on who you ask, maybe even more right-wing than Netanyahu, but he's also making the case that Netanyahu has got to go. And polling, though always unreliable in Israel, shows that if elections were held right now, Netanyahu wouldn't have a governing coalition unless he negotiated with Sa'ar's party. And who knows, maybe Sa'ar won't cave in like Gantz did. Now, as to, what to actually expect, what will happen, will Netanyahu finally be toppled from his throne? Nobody knows. Gershom Gorenberg, an American-Israeli journalist, tweeted on December 9th that when it comes to Israeli politics and elections, quote, "Pro tip, no one has a clue. Nothing that happens here is expected. This country exists to make fools of would-be prophets. The oracles speak gibberish. The prophets have their lines to heaven crossed. Sit back, hold on to your seats. The only certainty is the unexpected." End quote. So now let's move on to another piece of news related to Israel, one with hopefully a little more certainty behind it. Congress has passed the Nida M. Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, named after the soon-to-retire Democratic New York Representative Nida Lowy. The act, passed on Monday as part of Congress's huge omnibus spending package, sets aside $250 million over the next 5 years to fund peace-building initiatives like dialogue programs in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Now, I know this may sound kind of like cutesy, oh, how nice, more dialogue programs, but I think this is actually a huge deal. Let me explain. The $250 million fund created by this act is based on something called the International Fund for Ireland, which was started in 1986 to support peace-building initiatives in Northern Ireland, which was functionally in a state of civil war from the 1960s to 1998. To boil down a lot of detail, Northern Ireland was caught between people who wanted the region to associate with the United Kingdom and people who wanted to associate with Ireland. So political conflict grew into terrorism, militias, British Army involvement, and massacres. This also seemed like an unsolvable conflict that upended people's lives and caused a lot of long-lasting strife. Sounds maybe like a certain place in the Middle East, but in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement pretty much resolved the conflict, as the different factions in Northern Ireland set aside their differences and came together. Keep in mind, this is like a huge oversimplification, but this podcast is not about the troubles in Northern Ireland. The point here is that there are a lot of people working on and thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict who see the International Fund for Ireland as having been key to creating the dialogue that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So, for over a decade, an umbrella organization of Israel and Palestinian-related groups called ALMEP, or the Alliance for Middle East Peace, has been advocating for Congress to create a similar fund for Israel and the Palestinian territories in the belief that more investment will mean a sooner peaceful resolution to the conflict. Here's how ALMEP talks about this in a blurb taken from their website. Quote, "There are 13.5 million Israelis and Palestinians living in the region, yet the international community is spending less than $4 per person per year towards peace in the region. By comparison, to achieve a sustainable peace in Northern Ireland, the international community spent over $1 billion over 2 decades. This averaged spending of $33 per person per year starting 12 years before a peace deal was reached is almost 10 times the amount invested in similar efforts between Israelis and Palestinians. End quote. So it's not like more investment in peace building is a bad thing. So I'd say this is pretty great on its basic merits. But it's also awesome because in a world where Jews fight viciously over all aspects of Israel, in a world where J Street and AIPAC duke it out on the streets, in a world where everyone yells about theoretical 1, 2, 3, or bajillion state solutions, this is an actual concrete step to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, not just on the level of individual and minimally funded peace organizations on the ground, but as an organized international effort, and as an effort that doesn't say which solution to pick, that doesn't impose diplomatic negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian officials that realistically will go nowhere. There's no peace plan here, no land divvying up, no annexation who gets what talk. It's spending money to give agency to real people living in this place. And that's compelling enough for, of all things, the Partnership for Peace Act to have strong bipartisan support, for it to be co-sponsored in both the House and Senate by Democrats and Republicans. And I don't know about you, but in our current political climate, that level of bipartisanship is pretty much unbelievable to me. And if it sounds like I'm a little bit in love with, this Israeli-Palestinian peace fund, I'll be totally blunt. Yeah, I am. And I'm kind of pissed off that this has been an advocacy effort for over a decade, and I only found out about it by accident in 2019. I really do think more people should know about this. I've been through the polarization of Israel discourse on places like college campuses, and it kind of hurts to know that an initiative like this existed that could have helped us build bridges on campus. I mean, both AIPAC and J Street, mortal enemies on something like the Iran deal, support the Partnership for Peace Act. And I get that everyone's got something to say about the Iran deal, but wouldn't it have been good to focus on common ground? Maybe it's just me, but there's some food for thought here on the polarization in the Jewish community over Israel issues and the topics we yell about, and why there are things we can have a real conversation about, but are so beyond our radar that we never actually reach them. Again, maybe it's just me. Maybe I missed the big meeting about this Israeli-Palestinian Peace Fund when I got to campus. But anyway, Congress creating the fund is a big win that I think we can all appreciate. Finally, in hyperlocal news, there was some concern earlier this month about a new draft of the social studies standards for the state of Minnesota, not including any references to the Holocaust or really any genocides. Social studies academic standards are what they sound like. They set the broad standards for history education in Minnesota and are a key access point for different people, groups, stakeholders to make their mark on the education system. The standards go through a revision and update process every decade, and it takes about a year and a half to complete. Over the course of that time, there are several drafts and public commenting periods for those drafts. So the first of the drafts for this decade's revised social studies standards was released a few weeks ago, and the public commenting process runs from December 1st to January 4th. But with the draft, there were some eyebrows raised by the Jewish community and genocide education advocates, primarily in the form of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. The standards currently in place mention learning about the Holocaust and other genocides, but this draft, again, had no mention, which in a time of increased anti-Semitism and xenophobia and ongoing genocides and the legacy of genocides, that's not so great. Learning about this history is important. Now, I didn't report this story out, but I did have a quick dip in it with one interview, and it should be said that this wasn't a malicious thing. It's seen as an oversight of the drafting process at this point, not a great oversight by any means, but nothing really more than that. Keep in mind, this new draft is only 30 pages compared to the 150 pages of the current standards, so clearly not everything was brought in at the beginning. Thankfully, this is one of those, immediately sparks Jewish anxiety but actually resolves pretty well situations. After a public email writing campaign and comments and town hall Zoom meetings to get feedback on the draft, and after a meeting with the JCRC and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Minnesota Department of Education agreed to suggestions on mentioning the Holocaust and other genocides. The JCRC and the Center have a list of ways on how to do that, and the MDE seems to have accepted. There's always, a question of let's wait and see what shows up in the next draft, but from community advocates, there really isn't cause for concern anymore. And if you want to read more about this, links to the TCG Folk stories about it, written by editor Alani Goldsmith, are in the podcast notes. So, to paraphrase a Jewish community leader, and to let off on a high note, sometimes we get the win, and you know what? Let's take the win. Community advocacy makes an important difference. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.